If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The cold night air clung to the streets of Los Angeles as a squad car sped down a dimly lit alley, red and blue lights flashing against the graffiti-stained walls. A sense of urgency filled the atmosphere. A high-stakes drug bust was about to unfold, and in the passenger seat, sitting tall and alert, was Bruno, a canine police dog, a German shepherd with a heart as fierce as the battlefield he was trained for. His ears twitched at every sound, his eyes darted from side to side, his sharp instincts honed through years of service. This wasn't just a job for Bruno, this was his purpose, his duty, his loyalty to the badge and the man beside him. Sitting next to him was Officer Jake Carter, Bruno's handler, his best friend, and the man who had sworn to always have his back. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged through fire, blood, and battles that had left scars, both visible and hidden. As the squad car screeched to a halt, Jake reached over, ruffling Bruno's fur. "Ready, buddy?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with tension. Bruno didn't need words. His tail gave a firm wag, his body rigid with anticipation, his nose flaring as he caught the faintest scent of something Jake couldn't detect. They were a team, a perfect, seamless unit. Man and officer and canine, brothers. Bruno wasn't just any canine. He was a living legend in the department. Over the years, he had uncovered hundreds of pounds of narcotics, taken down violent fugitives, and saved more officers than anyone could count. There was the time when a desperate gunman had taken hostages inside a gas station. The SWAT team was preparing for a standoff, but Bruno had slipped through the back, silently weaving between the shelves, unseen, unheard, until the moment he struck like a ghost from the shadows. One moment, the suspect was holding a woman at gunpoint. The next, he was pinned to the ground, screaming as Bruno's powerful jaws clamped onto his forearm, disarming him in seconds. Another time, in a high-speed chase, when a suspect had abandoned his car and disappeared into the woods, Bruno had tracked him for miles, through rain, through mud, through the kind of terrain that would break lesser creatures. And when they found the man, armed and ready to fire at the officers, Bruno had leapt through the darkness, knocking him down before a single shot could be fired. He had saved Jake that night. He had saved all of them. And then, of course, there was the day that changed everything. The mission that should have cemented Bruno as a hero forever. Instead, it became the first chapter in the cruelest betrayal imaginable. The radio crackled with static before the dispatcher's voice broke through. "All units, armed suspects spotted at a warehouse on the east side. They're heavily armed. Proceed with extreme caution." Jake exchanged a glance with Bruno. He didn't even have to say it. They were going in. As the squad car raced toward the scene, Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Something felt wrong. His gut told him this was more than just a drug bust. It felt like an ambush. And Bruno? Bruno felt it too. His body went stiff, his breathing slowed, his nose twitched as if he could already smell the gunpowder in the air. When they arrived at the warehouse, officers were already in position. Snipers were perched on nearby rooftops, SWAT teams were moving in formation. It was a war zone waiting to explode. And Bruno was about to be at the center of it. Gunfire erupted like a thunderstorm. Bullets ricocheted off walls, shattering windows, slicing through the night like fireflies of death. And then, Bruno made the decision that only a warrior would make. The kind of decision that no one can train for, that no instinct alone can explain. A decision born out of pure, unshakable loyalty. Jake was moving into position when a masked man burst out of a side door, gun raised, aimed directly at his chest. Time slowed, a second stretched into eternity. Bruno saw it first, and in that instant he lunged. The gunshot cracked through the air, a single deafening explosion. Bruno's body twisted midair, the bullet tearing through his side, embedding itself deep into his flesh. But his momentum didn't stop. His jaws clamped onto the gunman's arm, shaking, twisting, bringing him down even as pain tore through him. Jake's heart stopped as he saw his partner collapse onto the concrete, blood pooling around his golden fur. But even then, Bruno didn't let go. He held on until reinforcements arrived, until the suspect was disarmed, until the fight was won. Then, and only then, did he let his body go limp. Jake was at his side in seconds, his hands pressing against the wound, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. "Hold on, buddy," Just hold on, he choked out. Bruno's eyes flickered open, weak but unwavering, as if to say, I did my job. Did I do good? Jake's vision blurred with tears. Yeah, buddy, he whispered. You did good. The ambulance sirens screamed through the night. Bruno had saved them all, and he had no idea that the very system he had sworn to protect was about to turn its back on him in the most heartless way imaginable. The fluorescent lights in the veterinary trauma unit buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the cold metal table where Bruno lay bleeding. The white bandages wrapped around his midsection were already soaked in red, and every shallow breath he took was labored, rattling in his chest like a fading drumbeat. He had saved lives. He had done his duty. And now he was fighting for his own. Jake Carter stood beside him, gripping his partner's paw with both hands, his fingers trembling, a war veteran, a decorated officer, a hero, and yet, here he was, powerless. He's strong, the vet murmured, adjusting the IV drip. The bullet missed his heart, but the damage is severe. We need immediate surgery, and even then, it'll be a long road to recovery. Jake nodded, but his gut twisted with a deep, gnawing fear, not just for Bruno's health, but for what came next. He had heard the whispers before. He knew how the system worked, and he knew that the department didn't like to spend money on damaged assets. Still, he refused to believe it. Not Bruno. Not after everything he had done. His canine partner had given them everything. There was no way they would just abandon him. Right? It was 2 days later when the first sign of trouble came. Jake was back at the precinct, filing paperwork for Bruno's medical expenses when his captain, a man Jake had once admired, called him into his office. Carter, close the door, he said, his voice measured, his face unreadable. Jake obeyed, but his pulse had already started to race. Listen, the captain sighed, folding his hands on the desk. I need you to brace yourself. Jake stiffened. What's going on? The captain didn't meet his eyes. The department has made a decision. They won't be covering Bruno's medical bills. Silence. Jake felt the words hit like a punch to the gut. His mind stalled, unable to process the absurdity of what he had just heard. What? He finally whispered. The captain exhaled heavily. They've assessed the costs, Carter. Between surgery, rehab, and potential complications, it's too expensive. Jake's hands curled into fists. Too expensive? Too expensive. This was the same department that spent thousands on armored vests, new patrol cars, and PR campaigns about how they valued their officers. This was the same Bruno who had saved countless lives, including officers that now sat behind their desks, crunching numbers, deciding if a hero was worth keeping alive. Jake felt rage rise in his chest like wildfire. You're telling me that after all he's done for this city, they're just gonna throw him away like garbage? The captain flinched but didn't disagree. Carter, I tried. I pushed back. But the higher-ups already decided. They've approved humane euthanasia. Euthanasia. They were going to put him down. The room blurred. The fluorescent lights hummed above him. The walls felt like they were closing in. No, Jake growled, his voice dangerously low. You don't get to make that call. I'm adopting him. Another sigh, another hesitation. Then came the final, crushing blow. You can't. Jake blinked. What the hell do you mean, I can't? The captain finally met his eyes, and Jake saw something in his expression. Guilt. Bruno is department property, Carter. A working asset. You know how it works. Once he's decommissioned, he can't be adopted by an active officer. They don't want the liability. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. Then let me pay out of pocket. They won't allow it. Then let me quit. I'll resign today if that's what it takes. It doesn't matter, the captain interrupted, slamming a folder onto the desk. His voice was tight, controlled, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. The paperwork has already gone through. Bruno is scheduled for euthanasia tomorrow morning. Jake didn't remember leaving the office. He didn't remember much of anything after that. All he knew was that his best friend was lying in a cold vet's office, still believing in a world that had just sentenced him to death. Jake didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove straight to the vet hospital. His hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He wouldn't let them do this. He couldn't. When he entered the building, he found Bruno awake, lying in his crate with a weak but familiar wag of his tail. Hey buddy, Jake choked out, dropping to his knees beside him. Bruno lifted his head slightly, sniffing the air before nudging Jake's chest. His way of saying, "I knew you'd come." Jake ran a hand over his partner's fur, swallowing the lump in his throat. "We're gonna get you out of here, okay? I promise. I don't care what it takes." But before he could say anything else, a voice cut through the moment. "Officer Carter?" Jake turned sharply. A woman stood in the doorway, a civilian, mid-30s, with a determined look in her eyes. "My name is Emily Vargas. I run an independent canine rescue group. I heard about what's happening to Bruno." Jake's body tensed. "How the hell did you find out?" She didn't back down. "A vet tech called me. They didn't agree with what was happening. I know the department is trying to get rid of him, but I can help. We can get him out, off the record." Jake studied her. Could he trust her? Could he afford not to? "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked. Emily didn't hesitate. "Because no hero should die like this." That was all Jake needed to hear. They had one night to save Bruno, and failure was not an option. The clock on the vet clinic's wall read 2:17 a.m. Jake paced the dimly lit hallway, his mind racing through every possible scenario. This wasn't just a rescue, it was an act of defiance. He knew the consequences. If they got caught, he would lose everything: his badge, his career, and potentially his freedom. But as he glanced through the small window into Bruno's kennel, watching his loyal, battle-worn partner lying motionless on the thin cot, the reality became clear. Losing everything was a small price to pay if it meant saving Bruno's life. Emily stood by the door checking her phone. "We don't have much time. The euthanasia procedure is scheduled for 7 a.m. If we wait until morning, there will be more staff and security will be tighter." Jake inhaled sharply. He had been trained for high-risk missions before, but never one like this. "How do we do it?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Emily glanced around before stepping closer, her voice a whisper. "There's a back exit through the service door. The vet tech who called me? He's willing to unlock it for us. But once we take Bruno out, we're on our own. The police will be looking for him." Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's fine. We just need to get far enough away before they realize he's gone." Emily hesitated. "And after that?" Jake didn't have an answer. He had spent his entire life dedicated to law enforcement, following rules, protecting order, and now he was about to become a fugitive, but there was no other way. "First, we get him out. Then, we figure out the rest." Jake crouched by Bruno's crate, reaching a hand inside. "Hey buddy, it's time to go." Bruno's eyes fluttered open, still foggy from the pain meds. But the moment he saw Jake, his tail gave a weak thump against the bedding. Jake swallowed hard. "You saved my life 100 times, Bruno. Now it's my turn." With gentle hands, he unlatched the crate and lifted Bruno, careful not to jostle his still healing wounds. The dog gave a soft whimper but didn't resist. He trusted Jake. He always had. Emily led the way, moving swiftly down the hallway toward the back exit. The clinic was eerily quiet. The only sound was the faint beeping of heart monitors from the recovery room. At the door, a young vet tech stood waiting, his face pale with nerves. He swallowed hard before handing Jake a set of medical discharge papers. "This will buy you some time," he whispered. "If anyone asks, you're just transferring him to another facility." Jake clasped the tech's shoulder. "You don't know how much this means." The young man nodded, then reached down and gave Bruno a quick scratch behind the ears. "Just get him somewhere safe." With that, he unlocked the door. Jake held his breath. Emily scanned the alley outside before giving a quick nod. Clear. Together, they stepped into the darkness, leaving behind the city, the rules, and the system that had betrayed them. The door clicked shut behind them. There was no turning back. By sunrise, every police department in the state had been alerted. The department's official statement was cold and emotionless. A retired K-9 unit, department property, has been stolen from a veterinary facility. Suspects include a police officer, now relieved of duty. This is an active investigation. The words felt like a gut punch. Jake wasn't a suspect. He was a man saving his best friend. He gripped the steering wheel as they sped down a remote highway, Emily navigating from the passenger seat. Bruno lay in the back seat, still weak but resting. Every mile put them further from the people hunting them, but closer to the truth. "Where do we go now?" Emily asked, glancing at Jake. His mind reeled. They needed a safe house, somewhere off-grid where Bruno could heal. Then, a thought struck him. My old military buddy, he has land in Montana, way off the radar. We can disappear there for a while. Emily nodded. Then that's our destination. But as she said the words, a flash of red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. Police? Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. The real fight had just begun. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the pale morning light breaking through the mist. Jake's hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. In the rearview mirror, the red and blue lights flickered like a silent warning. The chase was on. Bruno, still weak, lay curled in the back seat. His ears twitched, but his eyes remained half-lidded, exhaustion anchoring him in place. Emily sat rigid beside Jake, her phone gripped in her trembling hands. "Jake," she whispered, her voice tight. She turned the screen toward him. The news was already spreading. Breaking: ex-cop steals canine dog from euthanasia order, police manhunt underway. The broadcast played on loop, his name, his badge number, Bruno's picture. His whole life reduced to a scandalous headline. "They're making you out to be some kind of criminal," Emily breathed. "This is bad, this is really bad." Jake clenched his jaw. No, this was justice. Bruno had bled for the department. He had saved lives. And now, when he needed help the most, they had signed his death warrant. Jake refused to let that be his partner's final chapter. The police were closing in. A black and white cruiser had merged into the lane behind them, keeping its distance for now, but it wouldn't last. "Hold on," Jake muttered. And then, he floored the gas. The tires screeched as the car veered onto an empty back road, dirt and gravel spitting into the air. "Jake!" Emily shouted, gripping the dashboard. The cruiser behind them activated its sirens, the wailing sound splitting through the morning quiet. Bruno stirred in the back seat. His ears perked slightly, though his body remained still. "Just a little longer, buddy," Jake muttered under his breath. "Just hold on." Another police vehicle joined the chase, speeding up alongside them. Through the window, Jake could see the officer in the driver's seat, a man he used to call a friend. The officer held a radio to his mouth, probably calling for backup. The betrayal stung more than the pursuit. The road widened into an intersection, and up ahead, Jake spotted a railroad crossing. The barriers were lowering. A freight train was approaching from the distance. Jake's mind raced. If they stopped now, it was over. Emily's eyes darted between him and the train. "You're not seriously thinking about it." Jake exhaled sharply. Then he slammed the accelerator. Bruno lifted his head slightly as the car rocketed forward, the sound of the approaching train roaring in the background. "Jake!" Emily screamed. At the last possible second, they cleared the tracks. The train thundered past, a steel wall between them and the police. The flashing lights disappeared behind the blur of metal. They had escaped, barely. Emily exhaled a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she rubbed her face. "Jesus, Jake." Jake's grip on the wheel loosened. He risked a glance in the mirror. Bruno was watching him now, his deep brown eyes holding something Jake had seen so many times before: trust. They weren't out of the woods yet. But for the first time, there was a chance. It took them 14 hours to reach the cabin in Montana. By then, Jake's limbs were sore from driving, his head pounding from the tension. But as they pulled up the long gravel driveway, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The cabin sat in the heart of a forest, surrounded by nothing but trees, silence, and safety. Bruno stirred. His body was still weak, but as soon as the car door opened, his nose twitched, instincts kicking in. Emily helped Jake ease him onto the ground. At first, Bruno hesitated, his muscles stiff. But then, as the wind rustled the trees carrying fresh air, the scent of pine and earth, something seemed to shift inside him. He took a step, then another. And then, for the first time in days, he wagged his tail. Emily wiped at her eyes. He knows he's free. Jake swallowed hard. He crouched beside Bruno, resting a hand on his head. "We're safe for now, buddy." Bruno leaned into his touch, letting out a soft huff of breath. But Jake knew this wasn't over. The department wasn't going to let this slide. And if Bruno was this important to them, if they were willing to hunt them down over a single dog, then there was something they weren't being told. Jake was going to find out the truth. And this time he wasn't running. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long golden rays over the cabin. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, a cruel contrast to the storm that raged inside Jake's mind. Bruno lay on the porch, his chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths. His body was healing, but the wounds, the ones that couldn't be seen, ran much deeper. Jake sat beside him, one hand absently running through the dog's fur. His mind was racing. Why was Bruno so important that they were willing to kill him? A decorated K-9 officer, a hero who had taken a bullet to protect his handler, yet instead of honoring him, they had signed his death sentence. None of this made sense. Emily walked out of the cabin, holding her laptop in one hand and a steaming mug of coffee in the other. Her face was pale, her expression tense. "I think I found something," she said, setting the laptop down between them. Jake leaned in. On the screen, dozens of news articles flashed before his eyes. Stories about corrupt police departments, missing evidence, classified cases swept under the rug. Emily clicked on a link, and a grainy surveillance video filled the screen. The footage was dark, the camera angle shaky, but it showed a police raid, officers moving in on what looked like a warehouse. Jake's eyes narrowed. He recognized the unit patches. This was his department. And then, he saw Bruno. A much younger Bruno, leading the charge. Emily paused the video, zooming in on a single frame. A man stood in the background, a high-ranking officer. Jake's stomach twisted. "That's Chief Reynolds," he muttered. "Why would he be there?" Emily exhaled sharply. "Because this wasn't just any raid. Look at the timestamp." Jake's eyes flicked to the date, his breath caught in his throat. That was the same night Bruno got shot. Emily clicked again, pulling up another document, an internal report from the department. K-9 Unit Report, Subject Bruno. Status injured, removed from active duty, classified evidence secured. Jake frowned. Classified evidence? Emily's fingers flew over the keyboard. She pulled up a case file, one that had been sealed. Case number 381, Internal Corruption Investigation, Classified Witness Testimony, Evidence. Submitted, audio recording, K-9 Bruno's handler. Jake's blood ran cold. Bruno had been part of a case that was never supposed to see the light of day, and the evidence had been recorded through his handler's body cam. Bruno was never just a dog. He was a witness, and they wanted him dead because he knew too much. Jake's hands curled into fists. This wasn't about budget cuts, he muttered. They were never going to let him live. He's the only proof they can't erase. Bruno lifted his head, sensing the shift in the air. For the first time since their escape, Jake finally understood. They weren't just running from the police. They were running from something much bigger. Emily shut the laptop with a shaky breath. "Jake, we can't keep running. They'll never stop hunting him." Jake stared at the trees, his mind calculating their next move. Bruno had risked his life for them. Now it was time to return the favor. "We're not running anymore," Jake said. His voice was steel, his mind made up. Emily frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we take this to the public," Jake replied. "If Bruno's survival is a threat to them, then we make sure the whole damn world hears his story." Emily hesitated. "That could put a target on our backs." Jake glanced at Bruno. The dog watched him carefully, as if waiting for his decision. "He didn't back down when it mattered," Jake said. "Neither will I." Emily stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. They were going to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The night was thick with tension, the kind that clung to your skin like humidity before a storm. Jake sat at the worn wooden table in the cabin, his fingers drumming against the surface. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on him like an anvil. Bruno lay by his feet, his deep brown eyes never leaving his handler. He sensed it, the danger, the shift in the air. Emily sat across from him, her laptop open, the screen illuminating her determined expression. "I've put together everything we have," she said, her voice firm. "The classified files, the surveillance footage, and testimonies from other officers who left the force after speaking up. If we go public, we need to do it now." Jake exhaled slowly. Bruno's life depended on this. The world needed to see the truth. The injustice of a K-9 officer being sentenced to death after years of loyalty, the corruption that ran deep within the department, the betrayal of those who swore to serve and protect. "We upload everything," Jake said. "And we don't stop until this story is everywhere." Emily hesitated. "And what happens when they come for us?" Jake looked down at Bruno, his partner, his brother in arms, a dog who had given everything and asked for nothing. "We don't run," Jake said. "We fight." Emily's fingers flew across the keyboard, uploading files, scheduling posts, ensuring the story hit every platform at once. Breaking news exposed. The injustice against canine dogs. Corrupt police department sentenced a heroic canine to death after he saved his unit. Former officer fights back against the system to save his partner. This story will change everything. As soon as the files went live, the internet exploded. Justice for Bruno started trending within minutes. Animal rights activists, veterans, and law enforcement reform groups picked up the story. Thousands of people flooded the department's social media, demanding answers. And then came the phone calls. The first was from a reporter. "We need an exclusive interview." The second was from a lawyer. "I'll represent you and Bruno, pro bono." The third, however, was from a blocked number. Jake answered, and a deep voice filled the line. "You made a big mistake." Then the call went dead. It happened fast. Bruno's ears perked up first, his body going rigid. Then the sound of tires skidding on gravel. Jake bolted to his feet. Emily's eyes widened as she saw the headlights approaching. They had been found. The black SUVs tore up the dirt road, engines roaring, tires throwing up dust. "They're coming," Emily whispered. Jake grabbed his gun, his mind already in combat mode. Bruno was at his side in an instant, his muscles coiled, ready to defend. The first SUV screeched to a stop. The doors flew open. Armed men poured out. "Give us the dog." Jake stood his ground. "Over my dead body." Bruno let out a deep guttural growl, the kind that sent chills down a man's spine. The standoff lasted only a second. Then, gunfire erupted. It happened fast. Bruno's ears perked up first, his body going rigid. Then, the sound of tires skidding on gravel. Jake bolted to his feet. Emily's eyes widened as she saw the headlights approaching. They had been found. The black SUVs tore up the dirt road, engines roaring, tires throwing up dust. "They're coming," Emily whispered. Jake grabbed his gun, his mind already in combat mode. Bruno was at his side in an instant, his muscles coiled, ready to defend. The first SUV screeched to a stop. The doors flew open. Armed men poured out. "Give us the dog." Jake stood his ground. "Over my dead body." Bruno let out a deep, guttural growl, the kind that sent chills down a man's spine. The standoff lasted only a second, then gunfire erupted. Bruno's breathing was ragged. The hero who had saved so many lives, was slipping away. Tires screeched again. The SUVs peeled away, disappearing into the night. The world was silent. Then, sirens. Help was coming. But for Bruno, it might be too late. The veterinary hospital was chaos. Doctors rushed Bruno through the doors, shouting orders. Jake was covered in his blood. Emily gripped his arm. "He's strong, Jake." Jake couldn't speak. He just watched as the doors swung shut, and he prayed. Hours passed. Every second dragged like a lifetime. Then, finally, a doctor walked out. He made it. Jake's legs almost gave out, but the doctor's face was serious. "It won't be easy. The bullet was close to his heart. He needs surgery, a long recovery." Jake nodded, his voice hoarse. "Whatever it takes." Months later, the world knew Bruno's name. The case had exposed everything. Chief Reynolds was fired. Officers were arrested. Laws were changed to protect retired canine officers. But for Jake, only one thing mattered. Bruno, lying in the grass beside him, alive. His fur had grown back, his body still healing, but his spirit, stronger than ever. Jake stroked his head. "You're home now, buddy." Bruno leaned into him, his tail thumping. No longer a police dog, no longer government property. Just a hero, finally getting the life he deserved. Final message. Help fight for canine dogs like Bruno. Canine dogs risk their lives for us, yet too many are abandoned or euthanized after service. It's time for justice. Share Bruno's story. Fight for change.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.